Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. This presentation is entitled Principles of Reading the Maqasid School, or the School of the Objectives of the Sharia. In this presentation, we want to deal with the concept that governs this school. And this concept is derived from a number of principles. 6 are the principles that are listed here to be able to present this idea. The concept here is that fundamentally, according to the school, Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is all wise, all knowing. Al-Hakim, Al-Alim, Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Therefore, it is necessarily the case based on that belief and understanding that Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala created and legislated in wisdom. That He creates and legislates in wisdom. And they further say, in regards to legislation in specific, that wisdom could be understood. And we know rationally that the wisdom of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in many instances in the natural world becomes manifest, and this is the realm of science, so to speak. Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he wrote in his book Al-Ubudiyyah that there's a notion that we term as Sunnah al-Kawniyah and as Sunnah ad-Diniyah. The will of Allah as manifest within the universe and the will of Allah as manifest within His legislation. In any event, to get back to our presentation, this school of thought in the Maqasid of the Sharia, they believe that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is all wise in His legislation. And therefore they say that we must have iman that the Quran and the Sunnah are rooted in wisdom. And because Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is all knowing, Allah legislates in a way which aims to realize benefit for humanity. And in doing that, He makes clear to us that which is harmful. That's a fundamental principle in their belief and their approach to the Quran and the Sunnah. One is that Allah is all wise, all knowing, and this is a shared belief among all Muslims. And second, that we should have a belief that the Quran and the Sunnah are rooted in wisdom and they aim to realize benefit for humanity. Now, many people may not have come to that level of maturity, but this is a common sense belief. What becomes complicated is the understanding that the wisdom that's there in legislation can be understood in every case. There is a school of thought that says that the wisdom of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, His legislation, are not always understood, and that's a commonplace school. The minority opinion is that it can be understood, that wisdom can be understood. So let's focus on that in brief. The reason why they say it can be understood because the ruling that is based on wisdom has to come back to the objectives of the Sharia. And there's two positions on this. One is that of Dr. Taha Jabir, who says that all rulings must come back to 3 overarching objectives. Must deal with the issue of Tawheed, must deal with the issue of purification or tazkiyah, purification of the self, or must deal with the issue of imran or cultivation of life on earth. The other school says all rulings must come to realize 5 purposes. Some add 6. 5 purposes. 1 is the legislation and preservation of the deen. 2, the preservation and cultivation of life. 3, the preservation and cultivation of intellect. 4, the preservation and cultivation of the family. 5, the preservation and cultivation of wealth. And the 6th opinion that's added by Imam al-Qarafi is the preservation and the cultivation of human dignity. So any ruling in the Sharia would come back to one of these six, and because it would be grounded in one of these six, and we understand what these six objectives are, therefore we understand the wisdom of the Sharia. In the other case, all of the Sharia is grounded in three major objectives: Tawheed, Tazkiyah, Imran. All rulings come back to one of those three objectives. The difference is that Taha Jabir grounds his understanding of the Maqasid, Hafidahullah, in the Quran itself, and the other school grounds it in the reading of the Quran and the Sunnah as exemplified by the teachings of Imam ash-Shatibi rahimahullah. The second principle of this school is that we should read the Quran and the Sunnah in a systematic and interrelated manner. And what that means is that we don't dissect the Quran and the Sunnah and read each ayat or each hadith independent of the other text. We must read them in a manner which is interrelated in light of one another. Yes, we can analyze the meaning of an ayah or hadith independently, but ultimately the greater concept that's derived cannot contradict the understanding that we derive when we read the Quran in light of itself or in light of the Sunnah, or an ayah of the Quran in light of other ayah and in light of the hadith, or a hadith in light of other hadith, and so on and so forth. We have to read it in a way which is interrelated with the text, either the Quran or the Sunnah, or the Quran and the Sunnah together. So if we're reading the Quran, we're reading an ayat of the Quran, it must relate to the other ayat of the Quran. Then we will come and we will take our understanding and relate it to the Sunnah. We have to read them in light of one another. The same thing is for hadith. We read a hadith, then we relate it to other hadith, and then we relate that to the teachings of the Quran. This is just a brief presentation to try to simplify something which is very systematic and demands scholarly principles. But we have to come to understand that this teaching is fundamental. We cannot sever the text of the Quran or the Sunnah from the understanding that the Quran and the Sunnah have to be read in an interrelated manner, that the meaning is part of an intrinsic whole, and that intrinsic whole is embodied within the Maqasid of the Sharia. The third principle is being moderate in our reading of the Quran and the Sunnah and in our practice. Moderation, we can agree, is the term which we can debate over its definition. But in this school, it is the Maqasid of the Sharia which grants us that moderation. It is the Maqasid of the Sharia which grants us, more specifically, the definition of what moderation is, and teach us how our practice should be balanced. Mind you, this school also places great emphasis on understanding the Quran and Sunnah in light of the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad. And we are well aware of the fact that the scholars of Hadith define the Sunnah in such a manner that it encompasses the seerah or the life of the Prophet Muhammad. But for many people, they consider Hadith to be the Sunnah. So we have to emphasize reading the Quran and Sunnah in light of the seerah so that they can understand what we mean. Because if we were to say to read the Quran in light of the Sunnah, it doesn't really bring home the point. So what we want to do is read the ahadith and the Quran to be more specific and precise in light of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. The fourth understanding is that we understand how the Quran and the Sunnah relate to our reality today, to life today, to the contemporary problems that we engage and encounter. The fifth understanding is based on the teaching of the Quran and the Sunnah, and that is that we facilitate matters for people. It's based on the idea that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, He wants yusr for us. He wants ease for us. And that comes from the teaching of the Quran itself, and from the teaching that when the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was faced with two matters which were halal, he always picked the easiest of the two. And lastly, this understanding or this mind which is created from reading the Quran and the Sunnah in light of Maqasid according to these principles should lead us to openness, dialogue, and tolerance. So the Maqasid of the Sharia themselves, when understood in the proper light, allow us the openness that is necessary to engage others in dialogue and to be tolerant when it is necessary to be tolerant. Now, these are concepts which demand explanation, but this is not the time and the place for that. What openness means, what dialogue means, what tolerance means, what moderation means, these are things that need explication. As far as understanding how the Quran and the Sunnah relate today, that is a matter which also is profound, because it is a matter which entails in many events that we engage ijtihad, that we engage researching the Quran and the Sunnah directly to see how they relate to life. And this is a matter which we find many people are confused over, or which people tend to simplify or not deal with in a scholarly manner and light. So, in brief, this principle follows the idea that the Quran and Sunnah are grounded in wisdom, and that the legislation of the Quran and the Sunnah aims only to realize benefit and goodness for the human being. It's a very optimistic concept. It's grounded in the belief that Allah created this world in goodness and in wisdom, and that He only desires wisdom and goodness for His creation, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that we read the Quran and the Sunnah in a systematic and interrelated manner is the second principle. And that being moderate in our reading of the Quran and the Sunnah in our practice is the third principle. And that we understand how the Quran and the Sunnah relate to today, to contemporary situations, is the fourth principle. Facilitating matters for people is the fifth principle. Openness, dialogue, and tolerance is the sixth principle. And these are the principles which characterize the school of Maqasid, the contemporary school of Maqasid in reading the Quran and the Sunnah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين.